Barbara Elaine Chapman lived in a quiet home just north of the small village of Frankford in Ontario, Canada. Frankford was a peaceful rural town near the shores of the Trent River. According to the census taken in the year 1971, the village had a population of just over 1,800 people. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other and crime was almost unheard of. Barbara was 38 years old in the winter of 1984. She was a mother of 2 young children, and her life centered around her family. Those who knew her described her as kind, thoughtful, and devoted to her children. Her home was not far from the edge of town, tucked away in a quiet area that felt safe, even in the middle of winter. On the morning of Monday, January 23rd, Barbara woke up early to begin her usual routine. The snow had settled overnight, but the roads were clear enough for the school bus to make its way through the rural route. She helped her 2 children get ready for school, prepared breakfast for them, and made sure they were dressed for the cold January weather. After walking them outside and seeing them off as they boarded the school bus, Barbara returned to the house. It was the last time anyone would see her alive. Shortly after the children left, Barbara called her mother. The 2 had a friendly conversation while Barbara tidied up around the home. She had no known appointments or visitors expected that day. Nothing seemed unusual at that point. The call ended with nothing out of the ordinary, and Barbara was alone inside the house. At some point after the phone call, something happened that would change everything. And whatever took place during those next few hours remains one of Ontario's most troubling mysteries. There were no neighbors who reported any suspicious activity that morning, and no one came forward with information about seeing visitors or strangers near the Chapman home. The day continued quietly until Barbara's 12-year-old daughter arrived home from school around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She expected to find her mother at home, like always, but the house was unusually silent. As she moved from room to room, calling out for her mother, she realized something was wrong. After searching for some time and finding no sign of Barbara, she eventually walked out to the garage. That was where she discovered her mother's body. Authorities were called, and investigators soon arrived at the home. The scene was carefully examined, and Barbara's death was determined to be a homicide. The cause of death, however, was not released to the public. To this day, investigators have never shared exactly how Barbara was killed. The lack of that detail has left the case clouded in uncertainty and has added to the mystery that surrounds it. What followed was an intense investigation that would last for decades. But in those first hours and days after Barbara's murder, no clear answers were found. The community of Frankford, once known for its quiet streets and peaceful way of life, was shaken to its core. In the days following the murder of Barbara Elaine Chapman, the Ontario Provincial Police launched a full investigation. Officers from the Criminal Investigation Branch, also known as the CIB, were brought in to assist. The seriousness of the case was immediately recognized, and investigators began gathering as much information as possible from the Chapman home and the surrounding area. One of the first steps was to speak with anyone who had been in contact with Barbara in the hours leading up to her death. Her last known conversation had taken place with her mother, but beyond that, there were no confirmed reports of visitors or deliveries that morning. Because Barbara lived in a more isolated part of town, there were no close neighbors who could report having seen or heard anything unusual. Forensic specialists from the Center of Forensic Sciences were brought in to help examine the scene. While certain findings were made, very little information was shared publicly. To this day, the official cause of death has never been released, and it is still unclear whether investigators withheld it for strategic reasons or due to the sensitivity of the case. Over time, law enforcement conducted numerous interviews with residents in and around Frankford. The community remained cooperative, but no one came forward with any substantial information that could point to a suspect. People in town began to grow uneasy. The idea that someone capable of such a crime could still be among them created an undercurrent of fear and suspicion. Authorities also explored Barbara's personal life for any signs of conflict or unresolved issues. They reviewed her routines, examined her relationships, and searched for any link that might lead to a motive. but there were no known threats, no history of domestic issues, and no clear indication of someone who would want to harm her. In many ways, the investigation was dealing with a case that had no obvious starting point. Despite their efforts, the investigators were working with limited evidence. This was the early 1980s, long before the advances in DNA technology and digital surveillance. With no eyewitnesses and no apparent motive, progress was slow. The longer the case remained unsolved, the more difficult it became to trace back the events of that January day. Several tips did come in over the following months, and each one was pursued carefully. A few names were mentioned, and some individuals were questioned, but none of those leads resulted in charges. In each case, the evidence was either lacking or too inconclusive to move forward. Barbara's murder soon became one of the many cold cases in Ontario. It was not forgotten by investigators, but the file began to gather dust as newer cases came in. Still, her family continued to hold out hope for answers, and law enforcement remained open to revisiting the case if new information emerged. Through the years, the Ontario Provincial Police would occasionally re-examine the file, especially when advancements in forensic tools became available. But each review came with the same result: no arrests, no official suspects, and no resolution. The mystery surrounding Barbara's death deepened as time passed. With each year that went by, it became more difficult to retrace the events of that winter morning in the small town of Frankfurt. Years after the murder of Barbara Elaine Chapman, her case remained unsolved, but it was never officially closed. The Ontario Provincial Police kept it classified as an open homicide investigation. From time to time, the file was reviewed by officers with fresh eyes, and new investigative techniques were applied as technology advanced. One of the most significant changes came with the evolution of forensic science. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, law enforcement across Canada began re-examining cold cases with the help of improved DNA analysis and trace evidence procedures. Barbara's case was included in this wave of renewed interest, and forensic evidence collected at the scene was reevaluated. However, nothing publicly confirmed ever suggested that a match was found, and no suspects were named. In the early 2010s, the Ontario Provincial Police Criminal Investigation Branch made another push. Working alongside the Office of the Chief Coroner and the Centre of Forensic Sciences, the case was reopened for deeper review. Investigators followed up on past leads, re-interviewed individuals, and attempted to identify any possible witnesses who had not come forward at the time. Despite this effort, no new breakthroughs were announced. As years passed without answers, interest in the case returned during discussions around other high-profile crimes in the area. One of those cases involved former Canadian military colonel Russell Williams, who was arrested in February of the year 2010. Williams had been based at Canadian Forces Base Trenton, located less than 15 kilometers from Frankfurt. His crimes had shocked the country, and his double life as a respected officer and violent offender led to public speculation about other unsolved crimes in the region. At the time of Barbara's murder in January of the year 1984, Russell Williams was a university student in Scarborough. He did not join the Canadian Armed Forces until 3 years later. Official sources have never connected Williams to Barbara Chapman's death, and there is no indication that he has ever been investigated in relation to her case. He has never been charged with anything connected to her murder, and authorities have made no public comments about any possible link. Outside of speculation, no suspect has ever been publicly named in Barbara's case. Over time, several theories have circulated among locals and amateur investigators. Some believed that the isolated nature of her home may have made her a target of opportunity. Others questioned whether the crime was random, or if someone familiar with her routines had taken advantage of a window of time when she was alone. There was also discussion around whether her case could be connected to any other unsolved crimes in the region. However, no conclusive patterns or links were ever established. Without additional evidence or a confession, the case has remained in the realm of mystery. Barbara's name has occasionally surfaced in media reports and public appeals for information, especially on anniversaries of her death. Law enforcement has repeatedly asked that anyone with information, no matter how small, come forward. Despite all these efforts, the murder of Barbara Chapman remains one of Ontario's most difficult unsolved cases. The silence surrounding what happened that day has endured for more than 4 decades. In the decades that have followed the murder of Barbara Elaine Chapman, her case has stood as a lasting reminder of how a life can be stolen without warning, and how justice can remain painfully out of reach. Though many years have passed since that cold January day in the year 1984, the investigation into her death has never officially been closed. The Ontario Provincial Police, in collaboration with the Criminal Investigation Branch, continues to consider the case active. The agency has confirmed that it has followed up on many leads over the years, some originating from the public and others emerging from periodic case reviews. Each tip is evaluated carefully, even if it does not immediately result in new developments. Police have emphasized that it takes only one piece of overlooked information to break open a case, and they have not given up hope that someone, somewhere, might hold that piece. One challenge that continues to face investigators is the limited physical evidence available from the original scene. In the early 1980s, forensic tools were not as advanced as they are today. While some materials were collected at the time, including potential trace evidence, there has been no confirmation that any of it has produced new leads through modern testing. Without any publicly confirmed DNA matches or conclusive witness accounts, the mystery has endured. In more recent years, advancements in forensic genealogy, a method that uses public DNA databases to trace unidentified suspects through their relatives, have played a key role in solving cold cases across North America. While it is not known if this technique has been applied to Barbara's case, the growing interest in this investigative tool has offered renewed optimism for many cold case detectives. Should suitable DNA be available, it may provide one of the last viable paths to identifying a suspect. Meanwhile, in Frankfurt and surrounding communities, Barbara's story continues to be remembered. Local media outlets and online forums have featured her case from time to time, especially on the anniversary of her death. These reports often include appeals from law enforcement and highlight the impact her murder had on her children and those who knew her. Barbara was more than a name in a report. She was a mother, a daughter, and a friend. Her sudden death left 2 children without their mother and created a wound that has never fully healed. Despite the silence from those responsible, the community has not forgotten her. Candles have been lit, memorials have been held, and conversations continue, all in the hope that one day there will be answers. The murder of Barbara Elaine Chapman remains one of Ontario's most haunting unsolved crimes. With every passing year, the urgency of finding justice grows stronger. For her family, for her memory, and for the community that has waited so long, the search continues. The Ontario Provincial Police still encourage anyone with information, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, to come forward. Even after more than 40 years, it is never too late to speak up. Duncan MacPherson was the kind of person who left a lasting impression on everyone he met. Born into a close-knit, loving family, Duncan grew up surrounded by friends and family who cared deeply about him. From a young age, his parents had noticed his charm, sense of humor, and natural curiosity. As he grew older, Duncan's personality continued to blossom. He was known for lighting up any room he walked into, and his carefree, adventurous spirit made him well loved by all. Duncan excelled both in academics and sports. Driven and ambitious, he was particularly gifted at hockey, a sport he'd played since he was young. His dedication to the game eventually earned him a spot playing professionally in Europe. With this promising career, his family and friends watched him soar proud of everything he'd achieved. It seemed as though he had his entire life mapped out ahead of him. In his early 20s, Duncan decided to take a break from hockey to explore Europe. This trip was meant to be a refreshing pause from his busy life and a chance to see the world before the next season began. His plan was simple: travel, visit friends, and return to his family refreshed and ready to get back to his sport. In August, Duncan arrived in the small town of Stubaier, Austria, where he planned to spend a few days skiing and relaxing. It was here in the serene beauty of the Alps that the story takes a dark and unexpected turn. On the evening of August 12th, Duncan left his hotel to meet a friend nearby, planning for a night of casual conversation and catching up. But that night was the last time anyone would see or hear from him. When Duncan failed to return, his family and friends became concerned. They knew him to be responsible, always keeping in touch and letting people know his whereabouts. But this time, there was nothing. No phone call, no message, nothing to indicate where he might have gone or why he hadn't returned. Concern turned to worry, and soon Duncan's family realized that something was deeply wrong. As the hours passed and no sign of Duncan appeared, the alarm was raised, and the local authorities became involved. The police conducted a preliminary search of the area, but there were no immediate signs or clues about his whereabouts. His family, now fearing the worst, flew from Canada to Austria, desperate to find answers. With every passing hour, the urgency grew, and the mystery around Duncan's disappearance deepened. By all accounts, Duncan's trip to Austria was supposed to be a peaceful adventure, brief escape from his professional life. But now, with his sudden disappearance, that same trip became the beginning of a mystery that would continue to haunt his family, friends, and investigators for years to come. In the days following his disappearance, initial searches yielded no clues. Duncan's belongings were untouched, and his car was still parked where he had left it. His family and the authorities were left bewildered, struggling to piece together the timeline and determine what might have led to his sudden vanishing. As we continue, we'll delve into the increasingly desperate search efforts and the rising tension within Duncan's family and community. With Duncan MacPherson now missing for over a day, his family felt the full weight of fear settle in as they arrived in Austria to help with the search. The small town of Stubaier, surrounded by towering mountains and dense forests, held few clues about what might have happened to Duncan. Local police had started a basic search, but with no clear evidence of his whereabouts, the investigation quickly hit a wall. His family, alongside local authorities, decided that it was time to escalate efforts. Teams of searchers, including volunteers, police officers, and skilled mountain guides, combed through the area where Duncan was last seen. The alpine terrain made it difficult, with steep cliffs, winding paths, and dense forests creating a challenging environment. Search dogs were brought in, attempting to pick up Duncan's scent along the trails, but they couldn't track him. Hours turned to days, and every passing moment without a lead seemed to further dim hopes. Local authorities canvassed nearby hotels, bars, and cafes in case anyone had seen Duncan on the night he disappeared. They also reviewed possible witnesses from the ski resort where he'd planned to spend his time. A handful of people remembered seeing him on the slopes the day he vanished, but no one recalled anything unusual. Still, investigators kept digging, hoping that a small detail might provide a breakthrough. Meanwhile, Duncan's family worked tirelessly, handing out flyers and posting missing person notices all around the town. They contacted local news stations, pleading for any information, any witness, or even the smallest hint of a clue. At the time, there were no major suspects or evidence suggesting foul play. Yet, there was a growing feeling among family and authorities that something sinister could have happened. As more days passed without a single solid lead, the questions only deepened. Then, a small breakthrough came when investigators discovered that Duncan had rented a snowboard and planned to return it on the day he disappeared. Yet, oddly, the snowboard was never returned, suggesting that something might have happened while he was out on the slopes. This small discovery, reignited efforts and shifted the search back to the mountain trails and slopes surrounding the ski resort. Helicopters scoured the mountainsides from above, while ground searchers focused on rugged areas and steep inclines where someone could easily lose their footing. Search parties expanded into nearby wooded trails and cliffs, with safety experts carefully assessing areas that were more challenging to access. Every searcher remained hopeful that this time they might find something. A personal item, an abandoned piece of clothing, any trace of Duncan. But despite their exhaustive efforts, the search yielded nothing. Not a single clue led them any closer to understanding what had happened to Duncan that fateful day. For his family, the emptiness was suffocating. While they had come to Austria with a spark of hope, they were now faced with the grim reality that perhaps their beloved son was truly gone. As we move forward, we'll look deeper into the theories that began to circulate and the chilling discoveries that would later come to light, adding layers to Duncan's unsolved disappearance. Weeks after Duncan MacPherson's disappearance, the town of Styrbay slowly resumed its routine. Locals felt the tension ease, and the heavy search operations around the mountain had dwindled. Yet, for Duncan's family, the nightmare was far from over. Despite having no solid leads or explanations, they remained steadfast, pushing investigators to continue digging for answers. Then, in an unexpected turn, the family received startling news. A few hikers, venturing further up one of the remote icy trails, had come across an item that seemed out of place among the pristine snow. It was a small piece of torn fabric, partially buried under a light dusting of fresh snow and only visible because of the hikers' keen eyes. The discovery was instantly relayed to the authorities, and the piece of fabric was quickly taken for analysis. Initial tests revealed that the fabric matched the type of clothing Duncan was known to have worn. The shred of evidence was the first tangible clue connected to his last known whereabouts, providing a small glimmer of hope. Investigators hypothesized that Duncan might have taken an off-trail route and somehow lost his way or been injured. This theory aligned with the discovery of the fabric, suggesting he may have stumbled into a dangerous area or encountered an unexpected hazard. Yet, despite the breakthrough, no further items of Duncan's clothing or belongings were found in the area, leaving investigators puzzled about what could have happened next. As the analysis of the fabric continued, a more troubling detail emerged. The cloth seemed slightly singed along the edges, as if exposed to extreme cold or heat. A strange finding considering the location and time of year. Experts couldn't conclusively determine the cause, but it fueled darker theories that suggested an accident or even a foul play. Still, with no witnesses and limited evidence, these were only speculations. The authorities decided to widen the search once more, this time focusing on specific trails and unmarked paths surrounding the fabric's discovery site. Specialist trackers, skilled in navigating rugged mountain terrain, joined the renewed search, painstakingly scanning every inch of the challenging terrain. Duncan's family was there every day, supporting the teams and holding on to the hope they might find something more. Amid the second wave of the search, eerie rumors began circulating among locals and visitors. Some mentioned sightings of unfamiliar figures roaming the trails at night. Others spoke of strange, sudden gusts of icy wind near Duncan's last known location. Although such claims lacked any solid basis, the unusual atmosphere added an unsettling element to the mystery, casting a chilling shadow over Duncan's case. As we move forward, we'll examine how these strange developments affected the investigation and explore the theories that began to circulate as experts, family, and friends sought the truth behind Duncan MacPherson's disappearance. As the search resumed with a focus on the area near the torn fabric, Duncan MacPherson's case garnered more media attention. News outlets, both local and international, began covering his disappearance, speculating on theories that might explain his fate. This heightened interest drew the attention of amateur investigators and independent researchers who traveled to Austria to examine the case for themselves. Duncan's family, desperate for answers, welcomed any insight, no matter how unorthodox. One prominent theory suggested that Duncan, in an attempt to take a shortcut or explore, might have encountered an unmarked trail and fallen victim to the treacherous terrain. Experts acknowledged that the glaciers and cliffs around Stubai could be perilous, especially in harsh weather. Yet, despite several helicopter flyovers and intensive ground searches in the area, no sign of Duncan's body was ever found, casting doubt on the possibility of a simple misstep. Experienced climbers familiar with the region found it unusual that no further traces, such as personal items or gear, had surfaced, which would be expected in an accidental fall scenario. Another theory was rooted in a string of mysterious disappearances in the Alps that shared haunting similarities with Duncan's case. Over the years, tourists and hikers had vanished under equally inexplicable circumstances, with little or no evidence to suggest what had happened to them. Some of these cases were eventually classified as accidental deaths, yet none involved such scarce evidence or puzzling details as Duncan's disappearance. This theory hinted at something more sinister, a potential serial predator, or even a hidden network of people with malicious intent, preying on unsuspecting visitors in isolated regions. While this angle seemed far-fetched, it gained momentum as investigators failed to uncover any concrete answers. Duncan's family, however, couldn't accept the notion of foul play without further evidence, despite the mystery surrounding the burnt fabric and the strange sightings reported in the area. They wanted more than theories. They wanted facts. In a final effort to find answers, they hired a private investigator with a reputation for cracking difficult cases, hoping a fresh perspective might reveal something new. This investigator began by interviewing locals, hikers, and anyone who might have seen Duncan in the hours leading up to his disappearance. He even tracked down and questioned people who had previously been involved in similar cases, in search of any connections that might have been overlooked. As these interviews progressed, one witness claimed they had seen a man matching Duncan's description walking alone down an obscure trail. The witness described Duncan as appearing slightly disoriented, but purposeful, as though he knew where he was headed. The sighting was perplexing, but it was one of the few accounts that seemed credible, and it gave investigators a hint that he might have ventured off the main paths deliberately. Just as the investigation seemed to reach another dead end, forensic analysts contacted the authorities with an unexpected update. They had found trace amounts of an unknown substance on the burnt edges of the fabric, something that didn't naturally occur in the environment surrounding the Stubai Glacier. While the analysis didn't reveal the exact substance, it hinted at human interference, fueling further questions about whether Duncan's disappearance had been orchestrated. With this new information, Duncan's family, along with the private investigator, pressed the authorities to keep the case open and continue pursuing answers. The investigation was no longer confined to the mountains, but was starting to explore connections beyond the isolated area, sparking renewed hope for some kind of resolution. In Part 5, we'll uncover the final developments and reflect on the lingering questions, theories, and the impact of Duncan's case on both his loved ones and the larger community. The search for Duncan MacPherson took his family, investigators, and even the media to places they'd never anticipated. Yet despite the combined efforts, the mystery remained unsolved, leaving an unsettling void for everyone involved. As new theories continued to arise, Duncan's family had to grapple with the reality that they might never know what truly happened. In the years following Duncan's disappearance, the investigation became something of a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers lurking even in places that seem picturesque and safe. The trace of an unknown substance on the fabric hinted at foul play, yet without concrete proof or a definitive witness account, it remained a puzzle piece that couldn't connect to anything else in the investigation. Every theory, from an accidental fall to the presence of a dangerous individual in the area, had holes that kept it from being the final answer. The sightings and suspicious circumstances that had sparked hope were, in the end, inconclusive, and Duncan's case became another entry on the list of unexplained disappearances. For his family, the years of searching had brought an indescribable blend of pain and resilience. They had reached out to countless resources, from specialized investigators to forensic analysts and amateur sleuths. Yet, each lead ended in more uncertainty. Finally, they made the difficult decision to shift from actively searching for answers to finding a way to honor Duncan's life and keep his story alive. In time, Duncan's family established a foundation in his name, dedicated to supporting the families of those who have vanished under mysterious circumstances. It became a way for them to channel their grief into something meaningful, providing resources and support for people who found themselves in the same bewildering position they had once been in. Their work also helped bring awareness to other cold cases, emphasizing the need for resources, attention, and compassion for those left behind when someone disappears. In the alpine communities around Stubai, Duncan's story continued to resonate, especially among locals who had helped in the search efforts and hikers who regularly traversed the glacier. Some even organized yearly treks in his memory, honoring a man they had never known but whose story had left a profound impact on the region. Duncan's memory became intertwined with the mountains where he was last seen, turning his story into a legacy that transcended his mysterious disappearance. Even though Duncan's case remains unsolved, his story serves as a powerful reminder of the enduring strength of family and community. His parents, though forever impacted, found ways to keep his memory alive and to advocate for others in similar situations. The truth of Duncan's fate may never be fully uncovered, yet the love, dedication, and resilience of those who cared for him have become a testament to the importance of hope, even in the face of the unknown. Thank you for watching this series on the unresolved disappearance of Duncan MacPherson. Please feel free to share your thoughts, and remember to stay aware of your surroundings and keep those you love close. In January 2013, Elisa Lam, a 21-year-old student from Vancouver, Canada, embarked on a solo trip along the west coast of the United States. Her journey took her to Los Angeles, where she checked into the Cecil Hotel, a historic and somewhat notorious establishment in downtown LA. The hotel, known for its past connections to crime and its eerie reputation, seemed like a strange choice for a young traveler. But Lam, who was studying at the University of British Columbia, was determined to explore on her own. She arrived at the Cecil Hotel on January 26th and initially stayed in a shared hostel-style room. However, due to complaints from other guests about her odd behavior, she was moved to a private room. Lam had been in regular contact with her family throughout her trip, updating them daily on her whereabouts and experiences. But when January 31st came and went without any communication from her, her family grew worried. They contacted the Los Angeles Police Department, who began a search for Lam. Despite checking the hotel and the surrounding area, there were no immediate leads. The mystery deepened when on February 19th, 2013, the case took a grim turn. Lam's body was discovered floating in a water tank on the roof of the Cecil Hotel, over 2 weeks after she was last seen. This discovery was made only after guests complained about the hotel's water pressure and the strange taste and color of the water. The discovery of Elisa Lam's body was both shocking and baffling. On February 19th, 2013, Santiago Lopez, a maintenance worker at the Cecil Hotel, was dispatched to address complaints from hotel guests about the water quality. They had reported that the water pressure was unusually low and that the water coming from their taps was discolored and had a strange taste. The complaints were serious enough to prompt a thorough inspection of the hotel's water system. Lopez, carrying out his routine duties, began by checking the rooftop water tanks. These tanks were crucial to the hotel's water supply, and it was here that Lopez made a chilling discovery. As he opened the hatch to one of the large water tanks, he was met with a horrifying sight. Floating in the water was the lifeless body of Elisa Lam. Her remains were floating face up, her clothes, from the day she was last seen still on her. The situation was grim. The water tank had to be completely drained before Lopez and his team could remove Lam's body. This was a complex and labor-intensive process, given the size and weight of the tank. Once the tank was emptied and the body was removed, investigators were faced with several unsettling questions. How did Lam end up in the water tank? How did she manage to get onto the roof, where the tank was located? The tank's lid was heavy and required significant force to move, making it seem unlikely that Lam could have accessed it and closed it behind her. The investigation now faced a puzzle, understanding how a young woman who appeared to be alone and in distress could have reached such a precarious and inaccessible location. The circumstances surrounding Lam's death only deepened the mystery as authorities struggled to piece together the final moments of her life. The initial days following the discovery of Elisa Lam's body were marked by intense investigation and numerous puzzling revelations. The Los Angeles Police Department, along with other officials, scrambled to understand the circumstances surrounding her death. The investigation was fraught with complications from the very start. The first step in the investigation was to perform an autopsy. The examination, conducted by the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office, revealed some disturbing details but left many questions unanswered. The autopsy confirmed that Elisa Lam's cause of death was accidental drowning. Despite this conclusion, the specifics of how she ended up in the water tank remained unclear. The toxicology report, which tested for drugs and alcohol, yielded surprising results. Although Lam had a history of bipolar disorder and was prescribed several medications, including antidepressants and mood stabilizers, the report showed no traces of illegal drugs or alcohol. There were, however, detectable levels of her prescribed medications, but these were within normal ranges. This was puzzling, as some had speculated that her odd behavior might have been influenced by drugs or alcohol. One of the most haunting aspects of Lam's disappearance was the surveillance footage from the hotel's elevator. The video, which was released to the public, showed Elisa Lam acting in a manner that many found unsettling. In the footage, she appeared to be alone in the elevator, but her behavior was erratic. She pressed multiple buttons, stepped in and out of the elevator, and seemed to be hiding or speaking to someone who was not visible on the camera. Her movements were jerky, and she gestured with her hands in a way that many found strange. This footage quickly went viral, capturing the imagination of people worldwide. The video led to a surge in theories about Lam's death, including suggestions that she was under the influence of hallucinogens or experiencing a psychotic episode. The elevator footage was replayed endlessly, scrutinized by amateur sleuths and conspiracy theorists who sought to decipher its meaning. As the investigation continued, attention turned to the hotel itself. The Cecil Hotel, where Lam had been staying, had a notorious reputation. Located in downtown Los Angeles, it had been associated with various incidents and criminal activity over the years. Despite this, the hotel management maintained that Lam's death was an isolated incident. The hotel manager, Amy Price, provided key details about Lam's stay. According to Price, Lam had initially been booked into a shared hostel-style room with other travelers. However, complaints about her odd behavior from her roommates led to Lam being moved to a private room. This behavior was characterized by some as erratic, but there were no specific details about what the roommates had observed. Investigators faced numerous challenges in piecing together Lam's final days. The rooftop access was controlled by a locked door that required a key. The question of how Lam could have gained access to the roof without authorization was perplexing. The water tanks were located on the roof, and accessing them would have required climbing over a wall or through a door, which was not supposed to be easily accessible to guests. Witnesses from the hotel and the surrounding area were interviewed, but no one reported seeing Lam on the roof or acting suspiciously. The fact that Lam's belongings were found with her in the water tank, including the clothes she wore in the elevator footage, only added to the confusion. As the investigation dragged on, various theories emerged. Some suggested that Lam might have been involved in a prank or a game that led to her accidental death. Others speculated about foul play or even supernatural involvement, given the strange circumstances and the hotel's eerie reputation. Despite these theories, the police found no concrete evidence to support any of them. The investigation continued to focus on understanding how Lam ended up in the water tank and why she was behaving so oddly in the elevator. The case gained widespread media attention, further complicating the investigation. The release of the elevator footage and the macabre details of Lam's death fueled a frenzy of speculation and public interest. Online forums and social media platforms became hotbeds of discussion, with people from around the world weighing in on the case. The sensational nature of the case, eerie details surrounding Lam's final moments, contributed to a growing sense of interest and confusion. The investigation, meanwhile, continued to seek answers. The answers remained elusive, leaving many questions about Elisa Lam's death unanswered. The investigation into Elisa Lam's death continued to unfold in the months following the discovery of her body. As the case garnered more media attention and public scrutiny, the complexities of the situation became increasingly apparent. Despite the initial autopsy and toxicology reports ruling her death as an accidental drowning, several significant aspects of the case remained unsolved, leading to ongoing confusion and speculation. In the months after Elisa Lam's body was found, investigators delved deeper into the circumstances surrounding her death. They conducted extensive interviews with hotel staff, guests, and anyone who might have had contact with Lam during her stay at the Cecil Hotel. The focus was on reconstructing her final movements and understanding how she could have accessed the rooftop and the water tank. One of the major challenges was determining how Lam managed to reach the rooftop. The rooftop access was controlled by a locked door that required a key, which was not supposed to be available to guests. The door was typically only accessible by hotel staff, and there was no evidence to suggest that Lam had the necessary key or authorization to enter this restricted area. The investigation included reviewing surveillance footage from various parts of the hotel to find any signs of Lam or anyone else accessing the rooftop. Investigators interviewed maintenance workers and hotel staff to understand the hotel's security protocols and whether there were any lapses. Santiago Lopez, the maintenance worker who discovered Lam's body, was one of the key witnesses. Lopez described the difficulties he encountered when trying to locate the body. He had to drain the water tank completely and then cut open the tank to retrieve Lam's body. This process highlighted the physical challenges involved in accessing the tank and raised further questions about how Lam could have managed it on her own. Hotel staff provided conflicting accounts about Lam's behavior during her stay. While some described her as being somewhat aloof, others mentioned that she was generally polite and engaged in typical guest activities. The most detailed account came from Katie Orphan, owner of the Last Bookstore, who recalled Lam buying books and music for her family. Orphan's account was consistent with the idea that Lam had plans to return home, suggesting she was not planning to disappear or harm herself. The peculiar behavior captured in the elevator footage continued to attract attention. Many viewers and amateur sleuths speculated that Lam's actions might have been influenced by a mental health crisis or substance use. Some theories suggested that she might have experienced a psychotic episode, possibly due to improper medication management. However, the toxicology report did not support these theories, as it found no traces of illegal drugs or alcohol in her system. Further complicating the investigation, the circumstances of Lam's death raised questions about the possibility of foul play. Despite the absence of evidence suggesting a struggle or injury, some theorists speculated that she might have been murdered and then placed in the tank. The lack of clear motive or suspect made it difficult for authorities to pursue this line of investigation with confidence. Additionally, the autopsy report showed no signs of trauma, which ruled out the possibility of a violent death. As the investigation progressed, The Los Angeles Police Department continued to review evidence and explore potential leads. They conducted thorough searches of the hotel premises and surrounding areas, but no new information emerged that could explain how Lam ended up in the water tank. The case remained a perplexing mystery, with no conclusive answers about her final movements or the circumstances leading to her death. Public fascination with the case persisted, fueled by the eerie details and unanswered questions. Online forums and social media platforms buzzed with theories and speculations, but the lack of concrete evidence left many of these ideas as mere conjecture. The media coverage, while bringing attention to the case, also added to the complexity by amplifying various theories and fueling public debate. The ongoing investigation and public interest kept the case in the spotlight, but no significant breakthroughs emerged. Despite the extensive efforts by law enforcement and the media, the exact chain of events that led to Elisa Lam's death remained shrouded in mystery. The combination of her unusual behavior, the difficulties in accessing the rooftop, and the strange circumstances surrounding her discovery continued to puzzle investigators and the public alike. The case remained unresolved, with many questions still left unanswered about how and why Elisa Lam met her tragic end. By the summer of 2022, nearly a decade after Elisa Lam's mysterious death, the case finally saw a significant development. Through persistent efforts by the authorities and renewed interest in the case, Lam's body was conclusively identified. Despite numerous theories and extensive investigations, the identification of Lam's body in 2022 provided some closure, but left many questions unanswered. For years, the perplexing nature of Elisa Lam's death had generated intense speculation and numerous theories. From the eerie elevator footage to the mysterious circumstances of her body being found in the water tank, every aspect of the case seemed to invite more questions than answers. Various theories had circulated, ranging from foul play and mental health crises to supernatural explanations. Despite the extensive media coverage and public interest, the true sequence of events remained elusive. The identification of Lam's body in 2022 was a result of the authorities' continued efforts to revisit and review the case. With advances in forensic technology and renewed investigative techniques, the focus shifted towards resolving the lingering questions about her death. The identification was a pivotal moment in the case, as it provided confirmation of Lam's identity and clarified that her remains were indeed those of the missing Canadian tourist. Even with the body identified, the case continued to be shrouded in mystery. The investigation into the circumstances surrounding her death had been thorough, but the exact details of how Lam ended up in the water tank remained unclear. The theories and speculations that had emerged over the years still persisted, but the lack of conclusive evidence made it difficult to determine the precise cause of her death. The Los Angeles Police Department and other involved agencies acknowledged that, while the identification was an important step, the case could not be fully closed without resolving the remaining questions. The investigation into how Lam accessed the rooftop and water tank, as well as whether anyone else was involved, continued to be a focal point. Despite the advances in forensic science and investigative methods, the case remained a somber reminder of the complexities and uncertainties that can arise in even the most high-profile investigations. The ongoing fascination with Elisa Lam's death, fueled by the eerie details and unresolved questions, led to continued public interest in media coverage. Documentaries, podcasts, and online discussions kept the case alive in the public's mind, reflecting the enduring intrigue and unresolved nature of the mystery. The story of Elisa Lam is a poignant reminder of the challenges that can arise in investigations involving unexplained deaths. It highlights the limits of forensic science and the complexities of piecing together the final moments of an individual's life. While the identification of Lam's body provided some closure, the unresolved aspects of her death left a lingering sense of mystery. In the end, the tragic death of Elisa Lam remains one of the most haunting and enigmatic cases in recent memory. The combination of her unsettling behavior, the strange circumstances of her discovery, and the ongoing questions about her death continue to captivate and perplex those who follow the case. While the identification of her body was a crucial development, it did not diminish the enduring sense of mystery surrounding the tragic fate of Elisa Lam. On a warm summer night in late August of 1999, Jason MacCullough left a gathering at a friend's house in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. It was a humid evening, and the air was thick with the sounds of the neighborhood. Jason had spent time with friends on Joseph Young Street, but as the night grew later, he decided to head home. He lived with his parents just a short distance away on Russell Street. The fastest way to get there was by cutting through Highfield Park, a well-worn pathway that connected Joseph Young Street to Pinecrest Drive. It was a common route, one that Jason had walked before. The area was surrounded by duplexes, apartment buildings, and basketball courts, and many local residents used the path regularly. But this night would be different. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, on August 28, Jason MacCullough was shot at near point-blank range while walking along the pathway. Residents in nearby homes heard the gunfire, followed by the sound of footsteps quickly scattering into the night. Concerned, someone called the police. An hour later, at 2:30 in the morning, officers arrived at the scene and discovered Jason's body on the path between two apartment buildings at 100 and 104 Pinecrest Drive. He was less than 6 blocks from home. Jason was only 19 years old. By all accounts, he was a kind, quiet young man who had never been involved in any criminal activity. He had no known enemies, no history of violence, and no apparent reason to be targeted. His murder appeared to be entirely senseless. Investigators arrived at the scene and began searching for evidence, but there was little to go on. Jason had not been robbed, and nothing of value had been taken. There were no immediate suspects and no clear motive. The crime had occurred in a residential area where people lived, worked, and went about their daily lives. It seemed likely that someone had seen or heard something. Yet, as the hours passed and the investigation began, one thing became clear. Jason MacCullough's murder would not be an easy case to solve. When police arrived at the scene in the early morning hours of August 28, 1999, they immediately began securing the area and collecting any potential evidence. The pathway where Jason MacCullough was found was surrounded by multi-unit housing, meaning there were numerous people living nearby. Officers went door to door, hoping to find witnesses who had seen or heard something unusual that night. Some residents reported hearing a gunshot, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps moving away from the area. However, no one had seen the shooting take place, and there were no immediate descriptions of a suspect. With no security cameras in the area at the time, police were left without crucial visual evidence. Investigators processed the crime scene carefully. The fact that Jason had not been robbed suggested that the motive was not theft. There were no immediate signs of a struggle, leading police to believe that the attack had been swift and unexpected. The location of the shooting also raised questions. While Highfield Park was a known shortcut, it was also a relatively open space, surrounded by residential buildings. The fact that someone had fired a gun in such a public area meant the killer had either acted impulsively or felt confident that they would not be caught. Over the next several days, police expanded their investigation. They reviewed Jason's background, speaking with his family, friends, and co-workers. Everyone who knew him described him as a responsible and kind young man, with no involvement in criminal activity. He was known for volunteering with local organizations and helping neighbors with everyday tasks. There was nothing in his past that suggested he had been in danger. Despite the efforts of law enforcement, there were no clear leads in the case. Without a motive or a suspect, the investigation faced immediate challenges. Police appealed to the public for information, hoping that someone who had been in the area that night would come forward. However, in the days following the murder, no new witnesses emerged. As time passed, frustration grew within both the police department and the community. Jason's family was left searching for answers, while investigators struggled with the reality that the case was already becoming difficult to solve. With no immediate leads, police turned to forensic analysis in hopes of uncovering evidence that could point them toward Jason MacCullough's killer. Officers examined the crime scene carefully, searching for anything that might have been left behind by the perpetrator. They looked for footprints, fingerprints, or any objects that could be connected to the crime. However, the results of their search were disappointing. There were no obvious signs pointing to a suspect. Detectives also considered the possibility that Jason had been followed that night. They retraced his steps from the party on Joseph Young Street to the pathway where he was killed, trying to determine if anyone could have been watching him. The distance was just over 1 kilometer, a walk Jason had taken before without any issues. Given that the shooting occurred close to apartment buildings, police believed someone in the area may have seen something suspicious. Investigators broadened their efforts by speaking with individuals who had been near Highfield Park that night. They wanted to know if anyone had noticed a person acting strangely before or after the shooting. While some residents recalled hearing footsteps, there were no clear descriptions of a suspect. With limited evidence, police considered whether Jason's murder could have been a case of mistaken identity. This theory was difficult to prove, but investigators could not ignore the fact that he had no known enemies or criminal connections. If Jason had not been the intended target, it was possible that the person responsible had mistaken him for someone else. As weeks passed, the case remained at a standstill. Law enforcement continued to urge the public to come forward with any information, emphasizing that even the smallest detail could be significant. Despite these efforts, no one provided the key piece of evidence needed to move the investigation forward. Months after Jason MacCullough's murder, the investigation remained active, but progress was slow. Detectives reviewed every lead they had gathered, hoping to find a missing connection. The lack of physical evidence made the case difficult, and without witnesses willing to come forward, police were left with few options. In an effort to generate new leads, law enforcement released composite sketches of 5 men seen in the area around the time of the shooting. These individuals were considered persons of interest, though police never identified them as suspects. Investigators hoped that someone in the community would recognize them and provide useful information. Despite these efforts, none of the men in the sketches were officially linked to the crime. A year after the murder, an unexpected development put Jason's case back in the public eye. Authorities arrested a group of men for an unrelated home invasion that had occurred just hours before Jason was killed. This crime took place only a few hundred meters from the pathway where his body was found. During the home invasion, one of the men brandished a firearm, adding to speculation that Jason's murder could have been connected. However, while the individuals involved in the break-in were charged for that crime, none were ever formally accused in Jason's case. Over time, the investigation faced new challenges. Witnesses who may have had crucial information were either unwilling or afraid to speak. Some members of the community believed that people with knowledge of the crime were staying silent out of fear of retaliation. This silence made it nearly impossible for police to confirm theories or rule out suspects. Years later, Jason's case was added to the Rewards for Major Unsolved Crimes program, offering a financial reward for information leading to an arrest. Despite this incentive, no one provided the evidence needed to solve the case. Police have continued to urge anyone with knowledge of what happened that night to come forward, emphasizing that even after decades, it is never too late for justice. As the years passed, Jason MacCullough's murder remained one of Nova Scotia's most haunting cold cases. Despite continued appeals from police and Jason's family, no one had come forward with the crucial information needed to solve the case. Investigators continued to believe that multiple witnesses were present at the time of the shooting, but the silence surrounding the crime remained unbroken. In April of the year 2005, law enforcement announced they were searching for a woman believed to have been in Highfield Park on the night of Jason's murder. They did not disclose what connection she might have had to the case, but it was clear that investigators hoped she could provide new insight. However, there was no public confirmation that she was ever identified or located. In the year 2014, former Detective Tom Martin, who had worked on Jason's case from the very beginning, stated that investigators had come very, very close to laying charges that year. However, without a witness willing to testify or provide direct evidence, the case could not move forward. The challenge of solving Jason's murder mirrored the struggles seen in other unsolved cases, where key individuals remained silent despite knowing what had happened. By the 20th anniversary of Jason's murder in the year 2019, Halifax Regional Police released another public statement urging anyone with information to come forward. They emphasized that even small details could help break the case, and they hoped that the passage of time would encourage witnesses to speak. The case remained open, and police assured the public that they were still committed to finding answers. Jason MacCullough's family never stopped seeking justice. His parents, Carolyn and Alan MacCullough, continued to speak out, reminding the community that their son's life was stolen in an act of senseless violence. They urged anyone with information to imagine how they would feel if they had lost a loved one in such a way. The murder of Jason MacCullough remains a painful mystery. His name is still listed in the rewards for Major Unsolved Crimes program, and law enforcement maintains that solving the case is possible if the right person comes forward. Until then, his family, friends, and community continue to wait for the justice that has eluded them for so long. On a gray July morning in 1996, the body of Robert Dennis Blair Adams, a 31-year-old Canadian man, was discovered in a parking lot of an under-construction hotel in Knoxville, Tennessee. The discovery shocked the community and left investigators puzzled as they tried to unravel the strange and unsettling circumstances leading to his death. Blair Adams, a resident of Surrey, British Columbia, had embarked on a frantic and bewildering journey across 2 countries, seemingly in a desperate attempt to escape an unknown threat. His bizarre behavior in the days leading up to his death, combined with the peculiar details surrounding his murder, have turned his case into one of the most mysterious and chilling unsolved true crime stories in recent history. Blair's life had been relatively ordinary before the events that led to his tragic demise. He was known as a hard-working foreman in a construction company, well-liked by his colleagues and friends. However, in the summer of 1996, something changed. Blair began displaying unusual and erratic behavior, becoming increasingly paranoid and convinced that someone was out to kill him. He expressed these fears to his friends and family, though he never provided details about who or what was threatening him. On July 5th, 1996, Blair took a drastic step that marked the beginning of his ill-fated journey. He withdrew nearly all of his savings, emptied his safe deposit box of cash, jewelry, gold, and platinum, and set off for the United States. His attempt to enter the U.S. via the Canadian-American border was thwarted when immigration officials denied him entry, suspecting that he might be involved in drug trafficking due to the large amount of cash he was carrying. Undeterred, Blair continued to try crossing the border, eventually succeeding through a convoluted route that took him from British Columbia to Seattle, then to Washington, D.C., and finally to Knoxville, Tennessee. What drove Blair to undertake such a frantic and disjointed journey? Why did he choose to go to Knoxville, a place where he had no known connections or reason to visit? These are just some of the questions that have plagued investigators and those who have studied his case. As Blair's strange behavior escalated, so did the mystery surrounding his actions and eventual death. Next, we will delve deeper into the events that unfolded during Blair's journey, the bizarre incidents he encountered, and the moments leading up to the discovery of his lifeless body in that Knoxville parking lot. The more we explore, the more the enigma of Blair Adams' final days unfolds, leaving us with an unsettling and haunting true crime mystery that remains unsolved to this day. Blair Adams' journey from Canada to Knoxville was marked by a series of increasingly erratic and puzzling events. After being denied entry into the United States on July 5th, 1996, Blair refused to give up. He tried to cross the border again the next day, this time successfully entering the U.S. through Vancouver, British Columbia. From there, he boarded a flight to Seattle, Washington, and began his perplexing trek across the country. Blair's behavior during this period was anything but normal. Witnesses described him as anxious, paranoid, and convinced that someone was after him. On July 7th, he arrived in Washington, D.C., where he rented a car and continued his journey southward. Despite his apparent urgency, Blair's actions were disorganized and confusing, making it difficult for anyone to understand his motives or destination. On July 10th, 1996, Blair arrived in Knoxville, Tennessee, a city where he had no known ties, friends, or family. His choice of Knoxville as a destination remains one of the most baffling aspects of the case. Upon his arrival, Blair's strange behavior escalated further. He visited a gas station, where he asked the attendant for directions to a hotel, but instead of following the directions given, he wandered around aimlessly for several hours. Blair eventually checked into a hotel near the airport, but even this was not without its oddities. Surveillance footage from the hotel lobby shows Blair entering and exiting the lobby 5 times over the span of an hour, appearing visibly agitated and nervous. He finally rented a room, but, for reasons unknown, he never went to it. Instead, Blair left the hotel shortly after midnight, abandoning his belongings, including a large sum of money, his passport, and other personal items, in the parking lot. In the early hours of July 11th, Blair's lifeless body was discovered in a nearby parking lot. He was found half naked, his clothes scattered around him, and the cause of death was determined to be a violent blow to the stomach, which ruptured his internal organs. Strangely, no weapon was found at the scene, and there were no signs of a struggle. Even more bizarre was the fact that Blair's valuables, including the cash he had withdrawn, were left untouched. The sequence of events leading up to Blair's death only deepened the mystery. His frantic journey across 2 countries, the strange incidents along the way, and his inexplicable presence in Knoxville all pointed to a man who was terrified and desperate to escape an unknown threat. Yet, despite the growing evidence, the motive behind Blair's actions and the identity of his killer remained elusive. Next, we will explore the investigation that followed Blair Adams' death, the clues uncovered by law enforcement, and the theories that have emerged over the years in an attempt to explain this perplexing true crime case. The further we delve into the details, the more questions arise, leaving Blair's tragic story shrouded in mystery and speculation. The investigation into Blair Adams' death was as puzzling as the events leading up to it. Knoxville authorities were confronted with a bizarre crime scene that offered more questions than answers. From the outset, investigators were stumped by the lack of clear evidence pointing to a motive or suspect. The case quickly became one of the most enigmatic unsolved mysteries in the region. When Blair's body was discovered, investigators noted several peculiar details. His body was found partially clothed, with his pants turned inside out and his shirt removed. Scattered around the scene were his wallet, a fanny pack containing nearly $4,000 in US, Canadian, and German currency, a gold watch, and a pair of shoes. Despite the violent nature of his death, no weapon was found, and there were no clear signs of a struggle. Blair's belongings, including the cash and jewelry, were left untouched, ruling out robbery as a motive. The autopsy revealed that Blair had died from a severe blow to his abdomen, which caused internal bleeding and the rupture of his stomach. The force of the blow was so intense that it was believed to have been delivered with a club or a similar object. However, the lack of defensive wounds on Blair's body suggested that he may not have seen the attack coming, or that he had been incapacitated beforehand. Investigators combed through Blair's background, hoping to find a clue that would explain his erratic behavior and mysterious death. They discovered that Blair had no known enemies and no history of mental illness, though his mother mentioned that he had been experiencing periods of paranoia in the weeks leading up to his death. Blair had confided in friends and family that he felt his life was in danger, but he never disclosed who or what he was afraid of. One of the most perplexing aspects of the case was Blair's unexplained journey to Knoxville. Authorities could not determine why he had traveled over 3,000 miles from his home in Surrey, British Columbia, to a city where he knew no one. Surveillance footage from the hotel, combined with witness statements, painted a picture of a man in a state of panic, seemingly fleeing from an invisible threat. Yet, despite his apparent fear, there were no signs that anyone had been following or stalking him during his trip. As the investigation progressed, several theories began to emerge. Some speculated that Blair had been involved in criminal activity, or had stumbled upon something he shouldn't have, leading to his murder. Others believed that Blair's paranoia had driven him to an unfortunate encounter with a dangerous stranger. However, without concrete evidence, these theories remained just that, speculation. Law enforcement officials also explored the possibility that Blair had been experiencing a mental health crisis. His erratic behavior, sudden departure from Canada, and seemingly inexplicable actions could have been symptoms of a psychological disorder. However, this theory did little to explain the violent nature of his death, or the unanswered questions surrounding his journey to Knoxville. As the investigation continued, the lack of solid leads left authorities frustrated. Despite extensive efforts to trace Blair's final movements and interview potential witnesses, the case began to grow cold. The pieces of the puzzle simply did not fit together, leaving Blair Adams' death an open and unresolved mystery. Now, we will delve into the various theories and speculations that have arisen over the years, examining the possible explanations for Blair's death and the strange events leading up to it. Theories range from the plausible to the outlandish, each attempting to make sense of a case that remains one of the most baffling true crime stories in recent history. As the investigation into Blair Adams' death stalled, various theories emerged, each attempting to explain the bizarre circumstances surrounding his demise. Some were grounded in logic, while others ventured into more speculative territory. These theories, though diverse, all sought to answer the same question: what led to Blair's tragic and mysterious end? One of the most straightforward theories suggests that Blair was the victim of a random act of violence. This theory posits that Blair, disoriented and vulnerable, encountered someone with malicious intent in Knoxville. The motive behind the attack could have been anything from a robbery gone wrong to a confrontation that escalated. However, this theory struggles to account for the untouched cash and valuables scattered around Blair's body, as well as the absence of defensive wounds that would indicate a struggle. Another theory is that Blair was targeted by someone he knew, possibly due to his involvement in illicit activities. Some speculated that Blair had become entangled in a drug deal or some other criminal enterprise, leading him to flee Canada in fear for his life. This would explain his erratic behavior and the large sums of money he carried with him. However, investigators found no concrete evidence linking Blair to any criminal activity, leaving this theory largely unsupported. The third theory focuses on Blair's mental state in the days leading up to his death. His sudden departure from Canada, combined with his apparent paranoia and belief that someone was trying to kill him, suggests that he may have been experiencing a psychological breakdown. Some experts theorize that Blair could have been suffering from a condition such as acute paranoia or a psychotic episode, which caused him to perceive danger where there was none. In this scenario, Blair's death might have been the result of a self-inflicted accident or an encounter with someone who took advantage of his vulnerable state. However, this theory does not explain the violent nature of his death, nor does it account for the methodical way in which his belongings were arranged at the crime scene. Another compelling theory is that Blair's death was connected to some sort of secret or sensitive information he had stumbled upon. This idea suggests that Blair discovered something that put him in grave danger, prompting his frantic journey across the continent. Proponents of this theory argue that Blair's attempts to escape, including his erratic travel route and his efforts to evade detection, point to a deep-seated fear of a specific threat. Yet, without any concrete leads or evidence of such a secret, this theory remains speculative. Finally, there are those who believe that Blair's death was the result of a more sinister conspiracy. This theory posits that Blair was targeted by a professional hit, possibly orchestrated by individuals or organizations with the means to cover their tracks. The precise and calculated nature of the crime scene, with its peculiar arrangement of Blair's belongings, lends some credence to this idea. However, the lack of any clear motive or suspects makes it difficult to substantiate this theory. Over the years, Blair's case has drawn the attention of amateur sleuths, true crime enthusiasts, and conspiracy theorists alike, each offering their own interpretations of the evidence. Yet, despite the many theories, none have been able to conclusively explain the sequence of events that led to Blair Adams' death. Next, we will explore the lasting impact of Blair Adams' case, both on his family and on the broader true crime community. We'll also discuss the current status of the investigation and whether there is any hope for solving this haunting mystery. The murder of Blair Adams remains one of the most perplexing unsolved cases in recent memory. Despite the exhaustive efforts of law enforcement and the myriad theories proposed by those intrigued by the mystery, the true circumstances surrounding his death continue to elude definitive answers. As time passes, the case has become a somber reminder of how one man's tragic end can leave an enduring mark on those left behind. Blair's family has been profoundly affected by his death. His mother, Sandra Edwards, has spoken publicly about the deep emotional toll the case has taken on her and her family. The uncertainty surrounding Blair's fate has left her with unanswered questions and a lingering sense of loss. Despite the passage of years, she and other loved ones still grapple with the pain of not knowing why Blair was targeted or who was responsible for his murder. The investigation into Blair Adams' death has remained active, though progress has been slow. Despite numerous tips and leads over the years, the case has seen few breakthroughs. Law enforcement agencies have continued to review the evidence and consider new theories, but the case remains cold. The Knoxville Police Department and the Knox County Sheriff's Department have periodically revisited the case, hoping that new information or advances in forensic technology might provide the breakthrough needed to solve it. However, the lack of concrete evidence and the passage of time have made it increasingly difficult to piece together what happened in that dark parking lot. Theories about Blair's death have been extensively analyzed and debated, but none have been able to provide a clear answer. The mystery of why he traveled such a strange route, the nature of his injuries, and the cryptic arrangement of his belongings at the crime scene continue to baffle investigators and the public alike. Each theory offers a piece of the puzzle, but fails to deliver a complete picture. Blair Adams' story has become a cautionary tale about the complexities of human behavior and the challenges of solving crimes with limited evidence. His case highlights the sometimes inscrutable nature of criminal investigations and the often unpredictable paths that lead to tragedy. It also serves as a reminder of the personal impact that such mysteries can have on families and communities, leaving a lasting legacy of grief and uncertainty. In conclusion, the murder of Blair Adams remains an open wound in the annals of true crime. Despite ongoing efforts to uncover the truth, the case stands as a chilling example of how some mysteries can persist unresolved long after the initial events have faded from public view. As time moves forward, the hope remains that new evidence or insights might one day bring closure to this haunting and unresolved case, offering answers to those who still seek to understand what truly happened to Blair Adams on that fateful day in 1996. On the morning of December 3rd, in the year 1989, The streets of Sao Paulo were quiet but tense. It was a historic day. Brazilians were heading to the polls for the first democratic presidential election after more than 2 decades of military rule. The country had spent years under dictatorship, and this election marked a hopeful turning point. What no one expected was that one of Brazil's most successful businessmen, Abilio Diniz, would be kidnapped that very same morning. Abilio Diniz was known across Brazil as the head of the Pão de Açúcar supermarket chain, one of the largest and most powerful companies in the country. He was a wealthy man, respected in both business and political circles. That morning, as he drove to work in his Mercedes-Benz, he had no idea he was being followed. His routine was familiar. He had security, but the people behind the kidnapping had been planning for months. They knew exactly when to strike. As Diniz approached his office, a group of kidnappers disguised as medical workers ambushed him. A station wagon disguised as an ambulance pulled up quickly. In a matter of seconds, he was dragged out of his car and forced inside the fake ambulance. The kidnappers drove away before anyone nearby could react. It was fast, shocking, and professional. This was not a random crime. It had been carefully organized over a long period of time by a group made up of people from different countries. Some of them were Chilean and Argentinian. 2 of them were Canadian citizens named David Spencer and Christine Lamont. They had been living in Brazil for several months under false identities, renting apartments and preparing for this moment. The kidnappers' plan was to demand millions in ransom, but their reasons went beyond money. They claimed to be part of a left-wing revolutionary movement, and some had connections to radical political groups in Latin America. The operation was meant to raise funds for guerrilla activities in other parts of the continent. Inside one of the rented houses in Sao Paulo, Diniz was taken to a hidden underground room. This would become his prison. The room was small, dark, and built specifically for this purpose. He would not see daylight again for many days. At the same time, the news of his disappearance began to spread. As voters lined up at polling stations across Brazil, many were unaware that one of the country's wealthiest men had just been kidnapped. But behind the scenes, authorities were already starting their investigation. The next few weeks would uncover a complex plot involving multiple nations, secret identities, and a shocking international connection that no one saw coming. In the days that followed the kidnapping of Abilio Diniz, the search intensified. While police quietly investigated behind the scenes, Diniz remained trapped beneath a quiet residential neighborhood in Sao Paulo. His captors had transformed the basement of a rented house into a hidden underground cell. It was small, windowless, and designed to keep him out of sight. The room had thick walls and a tightly sealed door to muffle any sounds. Diniz had no way of knowing how long he would be kept there. To prevent him from keeping track of time, the kidnappers kept the lights on around the clock. They played loud music day and night, not only to disorient him, but also to keep neighbors from hearing any noises he might make. Ironically, this decision would later become a critical mistake for the group. Outside of the cell, the group responsible for the crime was trying to stay hidden. They were an unusual team, made up of Chileans, Argentinians, a Brazilian, and 2 Canadians. Each person had a role. Some had rented apartments in the city using fake names and false documents. Others had prepared the underground space where Diniz was now being held. The entire operation had taken months to set up. David Spencer and Christine Lamont, the 2 Canadians involved, had arrived in Brazil earlier that year. They had previously lived in Managua, the capital of Nicaragua, where they were active in supporting leftist movements in Latin America. When they came to Brazil, they did not come as tourists. They used fake passports and false letters of reference to rent homes across Sao Paulo. One of these homes would eventually be used as the holding site for Diniz. The group communicated cautiously, avoiding telephones and limiting contact with the outside world. Still, their presence in the neighborhood had not gone completely unnoticed. A neighbor had already complained about loud noises coming from the house. This small detail would become a turning point in the case. Back inside the cell, Diniz kept his mind sharp by thinking about his family, his business, and how he might one day escape. Though physically confined, he tried to keep his spirit strong. The captors had been instructed not to speak with him unnecessarily. It was part of a strategy to make him feel isolated and powerless. What the kidnappers did not know was that law enforcement had begun putting together pieces of the puzzle. They had no idea that their carefully constructed plan was starting to unravel. All it would take was one more mistake, and that mistake was just days away. As the days passed, local police in Sao Paulo quietly expanded their investigation. The unusual levels of noise coming from one residential home had already drawn attention. A neighbor, frustrated by the constant loud music, filed a complaint. This tip reached the hands of investigators, who were already on alert due to the high-profile nature of the disappearance. They began watching the house closely. Officers noticed suspicious patterns. The people coming and going from the property kept irregular hours. Curtains remained tightly shut at all times. Deliveries were rare, and no one from the house interacted with the neighborhood. The behavior stood out. Acting on growing suspicions, authorities secured a warrant and prepared a tactical operation. When the police stormed the house, they discovered what they had feared. Inside, behind the sealed door and beneath the floorboards, was Abilio Diniz. He had been missing for several days. He was alive and able to walk, though weak from the ordeal. The rescue was swift and carried out with precision, ensuring that he was removed from the property without further risk to his safety. The operation also resulted in a series of arrests. In total, 10 individuals were taken into custody at or near the scene. Among them were 5 Chilean nationals, 2 Argentinians, 1 Brazilian, and the 2 Canadians, David Spencer and Christine Lamont. Each of them had played a role in planning or executing the kidnapping. Further investigation revealed that 3 of the Chilean suspects had direct ties to a well-known militant group in South America, the Movement of the Revolutionary Left. Ulises Gallardo Acevedo had been identified as a high-level member of the group. Pedro Fernandez Lembach, also in custody, had a background in explosives and had previously served as the secretary of Chile's National Council of Political Prisoners. The third, Maria Emilia Badilla, had spent more than a decade in prison in Chile for political activities. Authorities found additional evidence inside the house and in the rented properties connected to the group. This included false identification documents, foreign passports, and equipment used in the construction of the underground cell. Investigators also uncovered materials tied to radical political groups operating in Latin America, strengthening the theory that the crime was politically motivated. The arrest of the Canadian couple was especially shocking in Brazil and abroad. Both Spencer and Lamont initially denied any involvement, claiming that they had been unaware of the full plan. However, evidence quickly began to raise doubts. Witnesses had seen them entering and exiting locations tied to the kidnapping. Rental agreements and forged letters linked them directly to the safe houses used by the group. As the news spread, the rescue of Abilio Diniz and the capture of his kidnappers became front-page headlines across Brazil and Canada. What had started as a calculated and secretive operation had quickly unraveled. The next step would be the trials, and international attention was only just beginning to build. In the months that followed the rescue of Abilio Diniz, legal proceedings moved forward quickly. The case attracted major media attention, not only in Brazil, but around the world. The involvement of foreign nationals, especially the Canadian couple, David Spencer and Christine Lamont, turned the trial into an international event. The Brazilian justice system prepared to try all 12 suspects, and public pressure to deliver justice remained high. The prosecution presented an extensive body of evidence, including fingerprints, signed rental agreements, witness testimony, and communications between the suspects. Authorities argued that the kidnapping had been carefully planned for several months. The political backgrounds of the Chilean and Argentine members of the group were used by the prosecution to suggest that the crime may have had ideological motivations, not just financial ones. David Spencer and Christine Lamont were accused of directly supporting the logistics of the operation. The court heard testimony about how they helped rent the properties used in the kidnapping, transport materials, and maintain communication between the group members. Despite their claims of innocence, the evidence showed that both had been deeply involved in organizing the crime. In September of the year 1991, all 12 suspects were found guilty. The Brazilian court sentenced each of them to a prison term of 28 years and 6 months. The harsh sentences were based not only on the crime itself, but also on the extensive planning, use of fake identities, and the multinational nature of the operation. Soon after the sentencing, the Canadian government began to receive petitions and pressure from advocacy groups, religious organizations, and members of parliament. Many believed that the trial had been unfair or that the punishment was too harsh. Christine Lamont's mother led a campaign back in Nova Scotia, gaining support from Canadian citizens who called for her release. Media outlets ran features questioning the fairness of the Brazilian judicial system. Despite the international attention, Brazilian officials stood firm. They insisted that due process had been followed and that the country had a right to protect itself from foreign criminals. In the early 1990s, tensions grew between the two nations as Canadian diplomats quietly negotiated for the couple's return. After serving just over 8 years of their sentence, both Spencer and Lamont were granted parole in late 1998. They were deported back to Canada shortly afterward. The decision sparked controversy in Brazil, with many believing that international pressure had led to preferential treatment. The other 10 convicted kidnappers served varying lengths of time, with some being deported to their home countries in later years. Brazil continued to monitor foreign political activists closely, and the Diniz case left a lasting impact on how the country handled cases involving international suspects. The case remains one of the most high-profile kidnappings in Brazilian history. It exposed flaws in international law enforcement cooperation, raised questions about political motivations behind violent crimes, and showed how diplomatic ties can shape the outcome of justice across borders. Decades later, the name Abilio Diniz is still tied not only to business success, but also to one of the most dramatic criminal cases in the country's history. In the mid-19th century, a family of Irish Catholic immigrants settled in a quiet farming township in what was then known as Upper Canada. This place, about 25 kilometers northwest of London, Ontario, was called Biddulph Township. The family would come to be known as the Black Donnellys, and their story remains one of the most haunting and controversial true crime cases in Canadian history. The Donnellys arrived in Canada from Ireland during a time of deep struggle. Like many others, they had fled the devastating effects of the Great Famine, which began in Ireland around the year 1845 and lasted for several years. Hoping for a better life, James Donnelly and his wife Johanna made the long journey across the Atlantic and eventually found themselves settling along a dirt road in Biddulph that later came to be known as the Roman Line. This stretch of land had a high number of Irish Catholic settlers, and while it might have seemed like a welcoming place at first, tensions soon began to rise. At the heart of these tensions was land. The Donnelly family built their home on land that was originally owned by the Canada Company and had been sold to a man named James Grace. Over time, another man named Patrick Farrell came to lease a portion of this same lot, and that would mark the beginning of a long and bitter dispute. In the year 1856, a case went to court to settle who had the right to live on the land. The judge made a final decision. The northern 50 acres would go to the Donnellys, while the southern portion would be given to Farrell. Though this legally ended the dispute, the resentment between the two men did not go away. Only 1 year later, in the summer of 1857, the feud turned violent. During a barn-raising event in the area, James Donnelly and Patrick Farrell got into a fight. The details remain unclear, but by the end of it, Farrell had been fatally injured and died 2 days later. James Donnelly fled the scene and disappeared from public view. Nearly 2 years later, he turned himself in to a local justice of the peace. He was originally sentenced to hang, but thanks to a petition started by his wife Johanna, that sentence was reduced. James Donnelly served 7 years in Kingston Penitentiary. Despite having served his time, this event cast a long shadow over the Donnelly family. Whispers began to follow them through the township. Some saw them as troublemakers. Others believed they had been unfairly treated. But the truth lay somewhere in the middle. As Irish Catholic immigrants living in a mostly Protestant area, the Donnellys were already seen as outsiders. Combined with their strong personalities, clashes were almost inevitable. Over time, the Donnellys became known for standing their ground. They didn't shy away from arguments, and they were often accused, fairly or not, of theft, arson, and violence. Some of these accusations may have been based on real events. Others were likely the result of gossip, fear, and long-standing grudges. Regardless, the family developed a reputation, and that reputation made them a target. By the late 1870s, tensions in the area had reached a boiling point. A group called the Peace Society, organized by the local Catholic priest, had formed with the goal of reducing crime and restoring order. Many residents joined the group and agreed to have their homes searched for stolen goods. The Donnellys refused. That refusal, along with years of anger and suspicion, set the stage for one of the most shocking nights in Canadian history. By the time the Donnellys had settled into their homestead on the Roman line in the mid-19th century, tensions between Irish Catholic settlers like themselves and the mainly Protestant residents of Biddulph Township were already present. These cultural and religious differences formed the foundation for a growing hostility that would continue to escalate over the following decades. The area was made up of many recent immigrants, with families arriving from Ireland, often in desperate circumstances following the Great Famine. Despite their shared heritage, divisions based on faith and class ran deep. After James Donnelly's prison sentence, the family resumed life on the farm, but their name had already been tied to violence. Rumors spread easily in small communities, and many residents viewed the Donnellys with suspicion. As their sons grew older, the family's presence became more visible and often more confrontational. Disputes over land boundaries, stolen livestock, and competition over contracts for services like stagecoach lines and roadwork placed the Donnellys in frequent conflict with neighbors. While the Donnellys were not the only family involved in such disputes, their involvement often seemed to attract the most attention and resentment. By the late 1870s, the town had become divided. While some respected the Donnellys for standing up for themselves, others saw them as instigators. Their refusal to back down from fights, both in court and in person, hardened public opinion against them. The local Catholic priest, Father John Connolly, tried to restore peace in the community by forming what was called the Peace Society in June of 1879. He encouraged parishioners at St. Patrick's Church to sign a pledge promising to allow their homes to be searched if they were suspected of harboring stolen goods. The Donnellys, however, refused to join. They saw the Peace Society as biased and politically motivated. Their refusal was viewed as defiance by many locals, and it only fueled suspicions that the family had something to hide. Not long after, a more secretive group called the Vigilance Committee emerged, formed by those who had taken the Peace Society pledge. This unofficial group began to monitor the Donnellys' movements and activities, operating in the shadows and beyond the reach of law enforcement. Tensions came to a head when the Donnellys clashed with others over stagecoach routes in the area. James Donnelly and his sons were operating a line that competed directly with another local line, and accusations of sabotage and harassment were exchanged between the rival companies. At times, coaches were vandalized or burned. And while there was never concrete proof of who was behind the attacks, fingers were often pointed at the Donnellys. As violence increased throughout the township, many residents began to feel that the legal system could no longer control the unrest. Property was destroyed, livestock was stolen or killed, and homes were set on fire. The blame did not always fall solely on the Donnellys, but they remained the center of controversy. At the same time, they continued to be targeted. Their barn was burned down on more than one occasion, and their family was frequently threatened. Through it all, the Donnellys remained outspoken. They were known for challenging those in power, including church leaders and magistrates, and they refused to leave their land. This fierce independence made them both admired and feared. But the sense that the law had failed to hold them accountable, whether real or perceived, created growing frustration among their enemies. By early February of 1880, plans to deal with the Donnellys through unofficial means were already in motion. Surveillance of their homestead had begun. The Donnellys were unaware that their lives were being watched closely by men who had decided that force was the only remaining solution. What began as social and religious tension had now become something far more dangerous. The township was moving toward a breaking point, one that would end in tragedy. On the cold night of February 4th, 1880, a group of men gathered quietly in Biddulph Township. These men, many of whom were members of the secretive Vigilance Committee, had been planning their actions in private meetings for weeks. They believed that the Donnelly family had caused enough trouble and that justice, at least in their eyes, could no longer be served through the courts. The plan was simple and brutal. Under the cover of darkness, they would head to the Donnelly farm on the Roman line and put an end to the family's influence once and for all. Most of the men were armed with clubs and guns. Some wore disguises. They believed their actions would be supported, or at least tolerated, by much of the community. As the group approached the Donnelly house just after 2 o'clock in the morning, they were led by a man named James Carroll. Carroll was a former constable who had known the Donnellys for years. He was also part of the Peace Society and had a personal history with the family. It was Carroll who knocked on the door, pretending to arrest one of the sons, Tom Donnelly, who was not actually at the house that night. Inside were James Donnelly, his wife Johanna, their sons Thomas and John, and their niece Bridget, who had been staying with them. When the door opened, the mob stormed inside. In a matter of minutes, chaos erupted. Gunshots rang out, and the house was set on fire. James Donnelly was killed first. He was struck in the head with a spade and then shot. His wife Johanna was beaten and left for dead. John Donnelly and their niece Bridget were also killed in the attack. By the time neighbors arrived and the flames were spotted, it was too late to save anyone inside. The house was nearly destroyed. What was left were the charred remains of 4 family members. Reports from those who examined the scene later confirmed that the family had not died in the fire, but had been murdered before the blaze was set. Only one family member survived the attack, William Donnelly, who had not been at the house that night. While the mob moved quickly and in darkness, there were witnesses. A young boy named Johnny O'Connor had been hiding under a bed during the attack. He had been staying with the Donnellys for the night and somehow went unnoticed by the attackers. Johnny would later provide a key eyewitness account of the events that unfolded in the house, naming some of the men involved. But the violence did not end there. Later that same night, the mob moved on to the home of William Donnelly, hoping to kill him as well. However, William had been warned in time and managed to escape. The attackers set his house on fire too, but William was already gone. News of the killings spread quickly throughout Ontario. The scale and brutality of the attack shocked the public. While many locals had long held negative views of the Donnellys, the violent nature of the murders turned the case into a national scandal. In a time when vigilante justice was not uncommon, the massacre at the Donnelly farm stood out for its planning, its ruthlessness, and its secrecy. The authorities now had no choice but to act. The community, once divided over the Donnellys, was suddenly confronted with the weight of what had happened. 4 people had been murdered in their own home. A 5th had nearly been killed. And the killers, many of them known in the area, had walked free into the night. The next phase would take place not in secret, but in the courtroom, under the watchful eye of the entire country. In the weeks following the massacre, law enforcement faced immense pressure to identify and charge those responsible for the murders. With much of the town gripped by silence and fear, the task was difficult. Still, a handful of witnesses came forward, most notably the young boy Johnny O'Connor, who had seen parts of the attack while hiding in the Donnelly house. His testimony would become the central piece of evidence for the Crown. By March of 1880, a total of 11 men had been arrested in connection with the Donnelly killings. The most notable among them was James Carroll, the former constable who had led the mob to the Donnelly home. Also charged were Thomas Ryder, John Kennedy, and several other men with ties to the Vigilance Committee. Despite the brutality of the crime, the prosecution faced significant challenges. Many in the community were unwilling to cooperate, and others feared retaliation if they spoke out. The first trial took place in London, Ontario, in October of 1880. James Carroll was the first man brought to court. The Crown relied heavily on Johnny O'Connor's eyewitness account, but the defense focused on discrediting the boy's memory, suggesting that he was too young and traumatized to recall the events clearly. Testimonies from other witnesses were vague or contradictory. Much of the evidence was circumstantial, and several key witnesses either refused to testify or changed their stories on the stand. Despite the public outrage, the jury in Carroll's first trial could not reach a unanimous decision. The result was a mistrial. A second trial was held in January of 1881. Once again, the prosecution presented Johnny O'Connor's testimony, along with other circumstantial evidence tying Carroll to the scene. But once again, the jury returned with a verdict of not guilty. Carroll walked free, and no one else was ever successfully convicted for the murders. The failure to deliver justice led to widespread disappointment. Public opinion was deeply divided. Some residents continued to believe that the Donnellys had brought violence upon themselves, while others were horrified that an entire family could be killed so brutally and that no one would be held accountable. In the years that followed, the Donnelly murders became one of the most notorious unsolved crimes in Canadian history. Books, articles, and plays were written about the family, often casting them as either victims or villains, depending on the author's perspective. The story became legend in Ontario, and the Donnelly name took on a near-mythical status, one that sparked debates about justice, revenge, and community silence. The surviving Donnelly, William, never fully recovered from the trauma. He lived the rest of his life under a cloud of suspicion and sorrow. For years, he tried to clear his family's name and push for justice, but the courts and the public had moved on. William eventually died in 1915, never seeing anyone punished for what happened to his parents, siblings, and cousin. Today, the old Donnelly homestead near Lucan is long gone, but the story of the massacre remains a powerful symbol in Canadian folklore. The case is still studied by historians, criminologists, and writers, not only because of its brutality, but also because it reflects the complex social tensions of rural communities in the 19th century. The question of how an entire town could allow such violence to happen and then let it go unpunished remains as haunting now as it did in 1880.